The first drops of rain splattered against the glass panels of O'Hare Airport, turning the panoramic windows into hazy mirrors. Outside, the runway shimmered in the light of dim lamps, and the roar of turbines broke through the glass walls of the terminal. Passengers of Flight 1723 from Los Angeles to Chicago bustled at the boarding gate, overloaded with suitcases and their own thoughts. Barron Trump, a tall, slender teenager with a thoughtful expression, sat to the side, flipping through the pages of a worn leather notebook. His fingers mechanically fiddled with the corner of the paper, but his thoughts wandered far beyond the notes. He was not a typical representative of his family. He avoided publicity, preferring silence and solitude. Today's flight was just routine for him, a short break before another commitment. However, he did not yet know that this flight would forever change his view of the world. The dispatcher's voice announced the start of boarding. Passengers lined up one by one. Some hurried to check their electronic tickets. Others thoughtfully scrolled through their phones. Barron stood up last, casually slinging his bag over his shoulder and pulling up his hood. His boarding pass read, "First Class, Seat 3A," but he didn't pay much attention to it. Just ordinary comfort, nothing more. Meanwhile, in another part of the terminal, slightly bent under the weight of the years, stood Samuel Bradley. An elderly Vietnam veteran in his 70s held a ticket with seat 27F, the farthest seat in economy class, wedged between the window and a passenger who would likely be cramped. He was used to this arrangement. He was used to the world looking through him like a foggy glass. Samuel sighed quietly, carefully smoothing his silver hair and pursing his lips. His old military jacket, adorned with faded patches, seemed to him like armor behind which he had learned to hide. In this jacket, he had been through a lot, and this flight, he thought, would be as ordinary as hundreds of others. He was wrong. When they both boarded, the cabin was almost full. The smell of morning coffee mixed with the aroma of new seat upholstery. Passengers noisily arranged their luggage. Barron quickly took his seat by the window, threw back his hood, and opened a book. For him, everything was happening according to the usual scenario. But then something unexpected happened. At the rear exit, there was a muffled argument. The stewardess's voice was tense but polite. "I'm sorry, sir, but someone is already sitting in your seat. There might have been a mistake." Samuel Bradley carefully brought his ticket closer to his eyes, frowned, and shook his head. "This is my seat, miss. I booked it in advance." The person already settled in 27F sighed in annoyance. "I'm sorry, but I was told I could sit here." The stewardess was clearly nervous, realizing that the situation could quickly escalate into a conflict. She was about to say something, but at that moment, Barron raised his head. He watched the scene for a few seconds, then pressed the call button for the stewardess. She approached quickly, still nervous about what had happened. "Yes, Mr. Trump. How can I help?" Barron nodded towards the veteran and calmly but confidently said, "I want to swap seats with this gentleman. Let him take my seat." There was a pause. The entire first class froze. Passengers looked at each other in bewilderment. Some involuntarily looked at Barron with curiosity. This guy had just voluntarily given up the privileges of first class. Not everyone in his place would do the same. The stewardess blinked, digesting what she had heard. "Are you sure, sir? Your seat is in first class. It's—" Barron nodded, not letting her finish. "I'm sure." When the stewardess approached Samuel and conveyed the offer, he raised his eyebrows in surprise. He turned and looking at the guy who, for no reason, had offered him his seat. In the veteran's eyes, disbelief mixed with gratitude flashed. Such things are not done just like that. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice worn by time and life. Barron extended his hand. "Yes, it's just a seat on an airplane, and you deserve it more than I do." The cabin fell silent. Someone in the economy class turned their head. Someone nudged their neighbor. The movement and noise subsided, leaving behind an electric pause, a moment when everyone, even unknowingly, felt that they had witnessed something significant. Samuel slowly shook the guy's hand before finally nodding. He slung his bag over his shoulder and headed to first class, and Barron walked deeper into the plane, ignoring the gazes that followed him. When he took his new seat at the back of the cabin, someone muttered quietly, "Damn, I would never do that." The flight had only just begun, but it was no longer ordinary. As the plane took off, The familiar rocking filled the cabin. Those who flew often casually leaned back in their seats. Someone nervously gripped the armrests, and others immersed themselves in books and movies, trying to distract themselves from reality. Barron Trump settled into the cramped economy seat, folding his hands on his knees. He felt neither discomfort nor regret. His choice was conscious. However, the slight tension in the air hinted that the passengers around him continued to glance at him, curious, disbelieving, sometimes respectful. He paid no attention to them. Meanwhile, in first class, Samuel Bradley carefully lowered himself into the soft seat. He looked at the armrests, the large legroom, the attentive smile of the stewardess handing him a warm towel. This was a contrast. He was used to being unnoticed, used to cramped spaces and modesty, and now, for the first time in a long time, he felt noticed. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" the stewardess asked. Samuel shook his head, taking a short breath. He was going to just sit and enjoy the quiet, but there was a strange excitement in his chest, as if something wouldn't let him stay silent in that seat. His gaze slid across the cabin, returning to the very guy who was now sitting in economy class. There was something familiar about his face, but the veteran couldn't remember where he had seen such determination in his eyes. The flight gained altitude, and time dragged on slowly. The veteran lost himself in thought, allowing his mind to take him back to the past. Nighttime Manhattan, noisy streets, the light of neon signs reflected in puddles after the rain. Young Samuel Bradley, just returned from the war, sat on the steps of a small diner. His clothes were tattered, his eyes tired. He didn't know what to do next. In his pocket, a few coins. In his soul, emptiness. Passers-by didn't notice him, but one person stopped. A man in a strict suit with a firm but kind gaze. He didn't rush past like the others. "Did you serve?" he asked, noticing the patch on the old military jacket. Samuel nodded, too tired to respond with words. "Come on, you shouldn't be alone." The man offered him a job, a place to stay, a chance to start over. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't pity, just offered a helping hand. That gesture became the beginning of a new life, and now after so many years, Samuel understood that the encounter had determined his fate. The veteran blinked, returning to reality. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrests. The name of that man. He remembered him, remembered who he was. He looked at the economy class and looked at Barron. Now everything fell into place. This guy, he was the grandson of that very man. Samuel took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just keep this story to himself. Maybe it was time to say what he had wanted to say for so long. He leaned towards the woman sitting next to him and quietly but confidently said, "I need to share something." His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness of years in it. The woman raised her eyebrows and leaned closer. "This guy," Samuel slightly nodded towards Barron. "His family once changed my life." She looked at him with curiosity, not interrupting. "It was a long time ago," he continued, "but I will never forget it." Meanwhile, in economy class, Barron turned the page of his book, unaware that in first class, his name had become the center of a story that was just beginning to unfold. As the plane continued its journey over the endless clouds, the atmosphere in first class gradually changed. People, accustomed to silence and comfort, now stole glances at Samuel Bradley. His story began to spread among the passengers, like a quiet fire fanned by curiosity and genuine interest. Samuel leaned back in his seat, taking a glass of water in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, but it was not from old age. It was from the realization of the significance of the moment. He kept returning to the past, to the nighttime New York, to the man who had reached out to him in his darkest moment. And now, after so many years, fate had brought him to the grandson of that man. The woman sitting next to him carefully turned to him. "You said that this young man, his family helped you?" she asked quietly. Samuel slowly nodded, his gaze still fixed on the figure of Barron Trump in economy class. The guy sat hunched over his book, unaware that his name had already become part of an unexpected story. "It was a long time ago in 1975, he began, his voice steady but filled with the depth of experience. "I was nobody, a soldier whom the war had thrown back into the world, but without purpose, without a future. I felt like everything was lost. The woman listened silently, her eyes filled with genuine sympathy. Several passengers, overhearing the beginning of the story, began to listen discreetly. That night, I sat on the street, outside one of the cheap diners. He continued. I didn't know where to go. I had 25 cents in my pocket and an empty soul. And then a man approached me, tall in a strict suit, with a firm but kind gaze. He paused, remembering those moments with painful clarity. He asked me where I had served. I didn't want to talk, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me answer. He listened, and then he offered help. No questions, no conditions. He gave me a job. He gave me a roof over my head. He gave me a second chance when no one else even looked my way. The woman gasped, guessing where the story was leading. Fred Trump? She whispered. Samuel nodded, his lips trembling slightly. Yes, Barron's grandfather, the man to whom I owe everything. By this time, the first-class passengers had almost stopped talking to each other. All attention was focused on the elderly veteran who was bearing his soul. I always wanted to thank him, but I didn't know how, he admitted. Time slips away too quickly. And now, his grandson is sitting there, not even knowing that his family changed someone's life forever. The veteran took a deep breath and then slowly stood up. There was a look of understanding in the woman's eyes. Do you want to tell him? She asked. Samuel paused for a moment. He felt the weight of this moment. There were things that couldn't be left unsaid. He nodded. Yes, it's time for him to know. The woman slightly smiled and then quietly pressed the call button for the stewardess. Meanwhile, in economy class, Barron Trump turned another page of his book. He had no idea that this flight was about to become the most significant moment of his life. The airplane cabin was filled with the hushed murmur of conversations, the sound of pages turning in books, and the occasional requests of passengers to the stewardesses. However, in first class, there was a special atmosphere, a tense anticipation. Veteran Samuel Bradley was about to do something he had long wanted to do, but didn't know how. The stewardess, noticing his hesitation, smiled gently and nodded, indicating that she supported his decision. She approached Barron Trump, who was deeply engrossed in his book. The young man almost didn't notice the surrounding noise, immersed in reading, until he heard a soft but confident voice above him. Excuse me, young man, came the voice over his shoulder. Barron looked up and saw the elderly man in the faded military jacket standing before him. His eyes, though tired, shone with deep sincerity. Barron blinked, trying to understand what was happening. Yes, sir? He asked, putting his book aside. The veteran took a deep breath, as if choosing his words. He knew what he needed to say, but suddenly felt that this moment held something more, something significant, something fateful. I wanted to thank you for your generosity, he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years. You did something today that is not often seen in this world, but there's something you should know. Barron slightly furrowed his brow, intrigued. He leaned back in his seat and gestured for the veteran to sit next to him. Samuel lowered himself into the adjacent seat, continuing to speak. A long time ago, in 1975, I was nobody. Just a soldier returned from the war, sitting on the steps of a small diner in New York. My clothes were tattered, my eyes tired. I didn't know what to do next. I had a few coins in my pocket and an empty soul. Barron listened intently, his gaze fixed on the veteran's face. The entire cabin seemed to freeze, sensing the tension of the moment. A man stopped by, Samuel continued, his voice slightly trembling. He didn't rush past like others. He asked if I had served, saw the patch on my old military jacket. I nodded, too tired to speak. He offered me a job, a place to stay, a chance to start over. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't pity me, just offered a helping hand. That gesture was the beginning of a new life. Barron felt a lump in his throat. He already knew the answer. He knew it from the very first word. That man was my grandfather, he whispered. The veteran slowly nodded. There was more than just gratitude in his eyes. This was a story, a long journey that had finally come full circle today. Fred Trump was a great man, Samuel said softly. He changed my life in a way I can never fully describe. And now, after all these years, his grandson does something equally selfless. This is not just a coincidence. This is a sign. Barron looked at him, not knowing what to say. He felt something strange, something more than just gratitude. It was a realization of something important, something profound. "I don't know what to say," he finally muttered. The veteran smiled and placed his hand over Barron's. "You don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to know what kind of man your grandfather was, and to know that today you continued his legacy." Barron swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. He had never thought of his grandfather in this light. For him, he had always been a stern businessman, a figure from the past. But now, in the eyes of this old soldier, he saw him differently, as a man whose kindness had changed someone's life. Between them, there was a silence, but it was that meaningful, important silence where words were not needed. As the plane continued its journey, Barron slowly pulled out his phone and typed a short message to his father. He looked at the screen for a long time, then, without hesitation, pressed send. "Did you ever tell me what kind of man Grandpa was? I think I just found out." As the plane continued its journey through the clouds, the atmosphere in the cabin was no longer the same. Something had changed. People who had been mere strangers a few hours ago now felt part of something bigger. This was one of those rare moments when destinies intertwined invisibly but tangibly. After his conversation with Samuel Bradley, Barron Trump couldn't find peace. He didn't know what exactly had made him think so deeply, the veteran's story or the fact that this story was connected to his family. He tried to read his book, but the lines no longer made sense to him. All that was in his head now were the words of the elderly man and memories of his grandfather, whom he had never known to be the way Samuel described him. But Barron didn't even suspect that his act had caused a ripple effect. In first class, passengers exchanged glances. One of them, a man in his 40s with a tired but noble face, broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir, but your story really touched me. My grandfather was also a veteran, but after returning from the war, he couldn't adapt. He always said that the hardest part wasn't the battles, but coming home. No one was waiting for him, and no one reached out to help." Samuel looked at him and slowly nodded. "That's true. The hardest part doesn't start on the battlefield, but when you're left alone with yourself. That's why I will never forget your grandfather." And Fred Trump. The man nodded thoughtfully, gazing out the window. He seemed to be recalling something personal. Across the aisle, a young mother holding a small daughter said softly, "My father wasn't a soldier, but he always told me that one small act of kindness can change someone's life." I think today we all witnessed that. These words made those around them think. The airplane cabin filled with conversations that would never have happened otherwise. People shared stories about their grandfathers, fathers, about people who had reached out to them in the most unexpected moments. Meanwhile, the stewardesses, having heard the veteran's story, also exchanged glances. One of them, a blonde in her 30s, whispered to her colleague, "My brother served in Afghanistan. He doesn't like to talk about it, but once he said that the most important thing is when someone just sees you, not as a soldier, but as a person." She took a deep breath, holding back her emotions. Then she resolutely approached the veteran and leaned towards him. "Sir, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service." In response, Samuel just smiled. He understood that his story had awakened something more in people than just sympathy. He had reminded them of something important, humanity. At that moment, Barron, sitting in economy class, took out his phone and reread the message he had sent to his father. "Did you ever tell me what kind of man Grandpa was? I think I just found out." A few minutes passed before a notification of a new message appeared on the screen. His father replied, "Grandpa didn't like to talk about what he did for others. He believed that good deeds don't need recognition. But I think he would be proud of you today." Barron took a deep breath. He felt that this moment had changed him. Perhaps it had changed everyone on that airplane. The passengers continued to talk, reflect, and share stories. The airplane was still flying over the clouds, but something in it had become different. The pilot announced the descent. The airplane gently began to lose altitude, and the passengers gradually returned to reality, gathering their belongings, turning off tablet and phone screens. But something in the air was different. No one sat in their seat indifferently anymore. People who had been mere strangers a few hours ago now felt part of something bigger. Samuel Bradley looked out the window, watching the approaching lights of the airport. He felt an inner peace. Today he had told his story, not because he sought recognition, but because he knew there are things that need to be heard. The wind of time sweeps away much, but kindness remains. As soon as the airplane touched the ground, the passengers applauded, not so much for the pilot, but for the entire flight that had become something extraordinary. People exchanged smiles, glances that said more than words. Samuel stood up and turned to Barron. "Young man," he said, extending his hand again, "I don't know if you saw your grandfather the way I knew him, but now you know what kind of man he was, and what kind of man you are becoming." Barron firmly shook his hand, feeling in that handshake something more than just gratitude. He felt a continuity, a connection of generations. "Thank you, sir," he said softly, "for your story and for sharing it with me." As the passengers began to disembark, some of them stopped by Samuel, shook his hand, thanked him for his story. The young mother with the child smiled at him and said, "Thank you for your example. Now I know what story to tell my daughter." The man whose grandfather the war had left without support simply nodded to the veteran and said, "You inspired me. I'll try to do something good, just like Fred Trump did for you once." Samuel smiled. He understood that this was not the end. This was just the beginning. In the waiting area, Barron pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. His father had written to him again. "Can we talk about Grandpa tonight? I want you to know more." Barron felt a warmth in his chest. He knew that this conversation would be different. Now he was ready to listen. Before exiting the airport, he glanced at Samuel one more time. The veteran looked at him, slightly tipping his hat, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind a story that would stay with Barron for the rest of his life. In a world where we often pass each other by without noticing how connected we are, this flight became a reminder. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change not just one day, but an entire life.